freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Okay, welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I am, as always, your host, Nico Perino, and I'm here in FIRE's DC headquarters today with my boss and FIRE president and CEO, Greg Lukianoff. Greg, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
We're here to kind of talk about The Coddling of the American Mind 1 year after its publication. Yeah. The paperback edition just came out. We just learned it was number 9 on the New York Times bestsellers list for paperbacks.
Yeah.
Something we weren't really expecting.
Yeah, no, I continue to be amazed how many people are buying the book still, and how often I get, approached to talk about it, and it's also really funny when friends of mine, people will recommend the book by this, and they're like, oh, I actually know the author. Yeah, what has been some of the most surprising or interesting feedback you've received about the book in the past year? Surprising or interesting. It was just, finding out that people had read it in other countries, for example, and were excited and inspired about it was a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah, we've learned it's been translated into a lot of languages.
We've given rights in 2 different kinds of Chinese. We sold a copy in Korea, for example. It's translated into Brazilian Portuguese, I believe. It's been selling pretty well globally.
One of the things that I find interesting is that they create new covers
yes.
for the books in different places. This, of course, if you're listening to this in podcast version, we have a video. You can find it at YouTube at youtube.com/thefire.org. Greg's holding up what is that, the UK edition?
This is the UK paperback, and this is the hardcover for the US. And you might note, and listeners, the UK paperback is tiny, and this was the one thing that John and I were sort of, we're happy at the success of the book in the UK, but they made it so that Lilliputians can read it. Like, the text is so incredibly small. And my mom's British, so I know that they're not actually smaller people. But yeah, this is the paperback version of the UK version.
And do you get any say in the design of those international editions, or does Penguin kind of?
This was funny that they sent us the copy for this one. It's got a bunch of cotton balls, like packing material, as in like it's kind of like you're protecting your kids using bubble wrap, essentially. So it's kind of what the image means. And John and I were both like, and they were like, no, we really like it, and we got some nominal say in it. But a lot of times, as even happened with the title, I'm like, well, I actually prefer to go with this thing. I'm like, no.
Yeah, well, I mean, this might be interesting or not interesting for our viewers or listeners. I mean, the process of just kind of putting out a book is not just writing the book.
Yeah.
It's also giving advice, input on the marketing of the book. So,
yep.
And the title of the book it's not something that authors always have 100% say in. The Coddling of the American Mind was not initially what you wanted to call it.
Nope, I want to call it Disempowered. I still think that conveys more of what I was trying to say to a degree for these students, because.
And this is the Atlantic.
Yeah. Well,
article.
No, actually, the Atlantic article I wanted to call something much more boring, called "Arguing Towards Misery," which I now accept is a terrible title. But it did convey exactly what I was trying to say. Was essentially that we're engaging in intellectual patterns that practically guarantee increased anxiety and depression. So "Arguing Towards Misery" at least was more precise than "Coddling the American Mind." But and so much of the argument in response to the article really was critical of it was really just taking on the title, and that was really frustrating to me, because I didn't want, it's like these are, and basically transferring coddling into spoiled. It's like we're not talking about spoiled kids. And that's one of the reasons why I was like, absolutely not. This will not be the title of the book now that we've signed the book deal to do a book about it. And we signed the book deal under the title Disempowered, because I liked the idea of explaining to students and to parents that really not what we're saying is so much that you're like, we're not saying that people are spoiled. We're saying that essentially things that allow you to function and be happy in the adult world are things that increasingly, parents, teachers are undermining, whether they know they're doing that or not. So I think that's kind of more what we're doing to this generation, is we're disempowering them to a degree in a way that's going to make them sort of predictably miserable. But at the last minute, they decided, nope, coddling the American mind or nothing.
Yeah, well, it's the Atlantic that picked the title, and then the Atlantic article was such a success that publishers are like, well, we don't want to lose equity in that.
Yeah, I'm stuck with it. We do in the book try to explain what we mean by coddling. We actually added like a little subsection saying that all we mean are the negative consequences of overprotection.
Yeah, I think coddling, definitionally, I think it fits what you're arguing.
Absolutely, it does.
And I think I'm more of a booster for the title than you are.
And a lot of people love the title. So when I bring up not liking the title, people are like, what? But it's partially because you end up in all these meta arguments, like, is this coddling or not? I'm like, well, it wasn't even like the title we chose.
Well, coddling is something that happens to people regardless of whether they want it to happen to them.
Yeah, it's done to them.
Yeah, it's done to them. We're not saying that kids on their own volition are weak, or young adults are necessarily weak. We're saying that there are certain institutions that are built up around them that don't let them empower themselves to learn certain skills in life. So, I mean, you said you wanted to call it disempowered.
Yeah.
What is it? What are some of the things that people, as they're coming up through adolescence and young adulthood, need to be empowered to learn themselves they're currently being disempowered by the institutions that surround them?
Practically everything. I mean, and that's something that John. One of the questions that we really wanted to research after the book came out was like how much of these phenomena that we talk about of coddling in the American mind are going on outside of the United States. And as best we can tell, and John has a lot of research for this on the Coddling website, a lot of these trends are at least in the Anglosphere, at least in the English-speaking world. And that's one of the reasons why we focus a lot in the book on things like parenting, because and this was a little experiment that John started having us do when we would give talks together, is just ask people to raise their hands how old were they when they were first let out? Mm-hmm. As in, like, when were you first allowed to go down to like the corner store by yourself or go outside by yourself? And for people, my age, I'm a Gen Xer and older and I'm somewhat younger too. The answer is usually like somewhere between 5 and 7. And for people who are closer to the generation to Gen Z or late millennials, like 90 or after, the answer was like 12 or 13, which and this would happen in almost every room that we talked. And occasionally we'd have one outlier, and we'd ask like, tell us about your situation, and a lot of times it was, well, actually I grew up in the Philippines, and or something in some other country. We've particularly for the kind of students who go to these elite colleges, we've really undermined childhood. We've overstructured it to a degree that the sort of natural kind of interaction between your friends in your neighborhood,
free play without parental supervision. I remember. I lived near a forest and a park, and I would go out in the morning and get into all sorts of trouble with my friends in the forest or in the park, but nothing that was going to hurt me. I mean, although I guess you could fall out of a treehouse and, but we weren't taking dramatic risks doing it. We lived in a very safe neighborhood, but it was through those experiences, no parents around, setting up sports games ourselves, coming up with unique scenario play. I don't know what it was, but that's how I became socialized.
And meanwhile, that's the way
mediated problems
kids have forever. It's partially through free play and unstructured time and figuring out some of these interactions on your own. And it's as if we thought we could just eliminate that with no consequence. So when you look at the childhood of a lot of kids who go to elite colleges, they're structured from 6 a.m. to bedtime.
And why is that? Is that because the parents feel they need to in order for them to get into these elite colleges, come from wealthy backgrounds, or is it out of fear that there are a lot of problems in the world and they want to insulate their children more or less, whether it's crime or I don't know. Yeah,
well, the answer is yes, because it's both. We write a lot about the perception of sort of dangerousness. Why in a generation that's possibly the safest in human history, we're so obsessed with safety. Mm-hmm. And definitely there is a major disconnect between how dangerous the country was. Like when we were, most of my childhood was in the 80s, and I was, that was approaching the height of murder for the country for all time in the 80s, and every year it seemed to get a little bit worse. But we weren't as paranoid about child abduction or a lot of these things.
Well, you talk in the book about how it was about around that time that they started putting missing kids in milk cartons.
Yep.
And you also started to get 24/7 news cycle
Yep.
that tend to focus on the more
Yep.
unsavory
But
aspects.
at the same time, statistically, it really was getting worse. Like the amount of violent crime, for example, was continuing to go up, and it would go up until about 1991 in some places, a little later in other places. But it's been plummeting since 1991, 92, depending on where you live. And it's as if our ideas of childhood haven't really caught up with that. In fact, we're more paranoid in our parenting style when it comes to safety issues than we were, say, in the 1980s when things were much more dangerous, flat out. I do think a big part of it, and we do talk about this in the book, but I think we probably should have talked about it even more, about the the pressure to get into some of these elite colleges.
We just had the admission scandal.
Oh yeah,
where people are now buying their. Maybe that's happened in the past, but
the admission scandal was definitely something that really should have brought home to people how much of a premium is placed on getting into some of these swanky schools now, in a way that they
and the lengths that elite families will go to get their kids into these schools,
to get them an international airport. That was a joke from The Simpsons. It was a Yale looking at the qualifications of a character played by Rodney Dangerfield, and like, I'm sorry, sir, but with a student of this low qualifications, you need to get us and he looks at the chart, an international airport in order to get him in. So definitely some part of it is the idea that the fear, essentially, that if they don't get into one of these fancy schools, you're going to be kicked out of the upper class, essentially. Like you're not going to be able to compete, and that, of course, seems nightmarish to people.
Well, let's try and connect some of the dots here for our listeners and viewers who perhaps haven't read the book before. So we're seeing this phenomenon of overprotective parenting, preventing their kids or insulating their kids from some of the free play.
Oh, and I do want to say one important point here. We are very clear in the book that we're talking about the problems facing the kind of kids who tend to go to the more elite colleges and bottom half and quartile of the economic ladder. Completely different situations. And I always feel it's really necessary to say that, because like there are great books like Robert Putnam's Our Kids, which I recommend kind of to everybody to talk about the problems faced by lower quartile kids.
So you're saying kids in lower quartile income brackets tend to have
they face very different kinds of problems.
Yeah, very different kinds of problems. But the problems that we're talking about with the more affluent members of society is overstructured time. You got cello lessons followed by soccer practice, followed by tutors, and no time to go outside, play with your friends, learn how to mediate differences, solve problems, and then they're going off to college, having spent all of their adolescence with their parents, kind of structuring their time
and their high school teachers.
Yeah.
And I think partially, we looked into this and we couldn't find really brazen examples of it, but definitely with the very appropriate increased concern about anti-bullying. That when I always emphasize this, I'm like the anti-bullying sort of movement of the last 20 years. My attitude about it was it's about time. We didn't need to be as physically abusive of each other as we were when I was kids, and definitely there was like powerful hope of homophobia, and this was all real stuff. But the negative side effect of being much more concerned about the interpersonal relationships of kids is that it once again leads to a situation in which conflict is intermediated by K through 12 professors and K through 12 administrators.
By authority figures.
And so what you end up with is a situation in which there's been very little unintermediated conflict in a lot of these kids' lives. And this is repeated again in the way we set up higher education, which has administrators to be aware of what you're doing sort of 24/7, which is why we joke, but we're also kind of serious that our one stock tip that came out of writing the book was invest in human resources companies, because what we are hearing is as these students are hitting quote unquote the real world, whereas there was once kind of a sense that they were going to these kids will never make it in the real world. My response has always been, or at least mostly been, no, they're going to change it. And at least what we're hearing, and we'll be interested to see if we can get data to support this. But what we're hearing from companies is they are seeing a crop of students that, for normal sort of interpersonal tensions, will rather than sort of sort it out with their coworker, they'll go to human resources or they'll go to somebody as an authority figure to try to fix it. And that's scary for all sorts of reasons, not just the mental health of the individual, employee or student, but also kind of like that's not how we handle these things.
The health of the organization and their relationships with their coworkers. So we get to college. I want to come back to that point. We get to college. Students have had their almost entire lives, affluent students at elite colleges have had their entire lives mediated by an authority figure. They get there, they hear a speaker they don't like. There's a student group tabling on campus that they don't like. They go to administrators and request, in some cases, censorship or action of some sort. And this is how you originally connected with John, right?
Yeah. Well, in 2013, 2014, for the first time in my career, and I've said this in so many interviews, I don't want to belabor it too much, but prior to 2013, 2014, in my 18-year career, students had always been good on free speech. And then suddenly, in 2013, 2014, they were suddenly demanding that speakers be kicked off campus or not be invited.
Generational shift.
Yeah, it was a massive generational shift, and it was extremely sudden. And a lot of the book is trying to figure out like where that generational shift came from.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about how there's a connection between that generational shift and rising rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicide.
Yeah.
So where does that connection lie?
Well, that came just from the observation that when I was, that comes from a very personal place, which I've talked about before, but bears repeating. In 2007, 2008, and I talk about this in grisly detail in the book, I went through a very bad depression. And I started, the thing that really helped me long term for this was studying cognitive behavioral therapy, which is all an approach, which is primarily an approach of looking at your own exaggerated thoughts and getting in the habit of essentially talking back to them. Like as in, something bad happens to you, and this was one that I had all the time. Like something slightly wrong goes in your life, I'm going to be fired, and I'm going to end up in the breadline. And I always had this kind of like it's all going to fall apart.
Or a date goes poorly, and you're going to be alone forever.
Yeah, you're going to be alone. Exactly. And we all have these kind of exaggerated thoughts. But interestingly, they found that if you can sort of get in the habit of sort of talking back to them, you can decrease your experience of anxiety and depression. And this was life-changing for me. And meanwhile, while I'm trying to teach myself, don't catastrophize, don't overgeneralize, don't engage in binary thinking about stuff, I was watching on campus administrators who seemed to be exemplifying catastrophizing or binary thinking or mind reading or all these things that I was trying to teach myself not to do, being like, wow, really seems like we're teaching a generation to do this stuff by example. And I got to think about this a lot more and realized that this sort of paranoid style of parenting, for example, it does lead to basically saying, actually catastrophizing is good. At least we can't think of any downside for it. Actually thinking of the worst outcome is good. All this kind of stuff. And, my thought at the time was, thank goodness students don't seem to be buying this. And then suddenly in 2013, 2014, you have this crop of students demanding disinvitations, demanding new speech codes, all this stuff, but at the same time couching it in the language of medicalization, of basically saying, like, because we'll be mentally harmed if this person steps foot on my campus or makes the following argument, et cetera, et cetera.
Trauma. They'll be traumatized.
They'll be traumatized. And this was not unheard of, but new in terms of the scope and scale that I was seeing of it. And so that's one of the reasons why I brought it to John, because I was kind of like, wow, like we seem to actually be doing the exact opposite what a psychologist would tell somebody to do. Yeah. We're not saying, you shouldn't fixate on this pain. You shouldn't concentrate all of your attention on it. Whereas it seemed like on campuses, they were telling people, oh, by the way, fixate on that, find as small of a slight as you can, and that's actually a secret sign of aggression towards you, for example.
And so we shouldn't be surprised then when these students or professionals in the workforce go then to an authority figure and say help, because they've been told all their lives that their perhaps irrational thoughts are not so irrational after all.
Yeah.
There's something you should be deeply concerned.
Well, yeah, and that's why one of the scenarios I give in the book is the idea of going to see it, to explain how I think of this, is to have a mythical sort of student going to the student counseling center and explaining that she's been feeling a little blue and a little down, and having the counselor be like, "Oh my goodness, you feel blue and down. You must be in very great. You're feeling anxious. You must be in very great danger. Where can we hide?" It's like no. That's not what you do. But when it comes to the intolerance for different political points of view, for example, and that's one of the reasons why in the book we talk about the 6 causal threads. One of them is a topic that's very close to the heart of both me and John. One of the reasons why we became friends in the first place, which is political polarization. And I do have sympathy for the fact that for the unfortunately really true situation is we've gotten so good at self-sorting, both in terms of what we do on the internet, but also what we do physically. These are people who might have grown up in a bubble where they weren't used to hearing people with radically different points of view from them. And not being particularly tolerant of them. Well, why would they? Because if you're in an echo chamber about this, those other people are actually evil. They're not people of goodwill. They're either stupid or evil. And so I do think that some of the isolation from each other, and certainly the hostility that's revved up in the past several years, makes the lack of tolerance for political points of view that you disagree with even more intense.
I was just recalling as you're mentioning that one of the offices of diversity and inclusion at Indiana University Southeast, have you seen these language guides that go around universities sometimes issue, like, this is biased language, this, and here's how you should respond to it?
Yeah, making a sad face because yes, and what is it now is kind of, so what does it say?
Well, so it recommends at Indiana University Southeast that if someone says offensive, that you respond with ouch, like literally the word ouch. And I read that and I thought, wow, that's exactly what Greg and John were talking about in their book, like the medical, like the idea that it's actually hurtful, like that it's almost, because ouch is your response to physical pain.
Yeah,
and now we're taught to use that in response to words that you find offensive.
Yeah, and this is crazy. And okay, so I'm going to talk about sticks and stones for a second, because I have to, because it makes me it really frustrates me when I see this sort of willing, or sometimes I think just people don't get what the sticks and stones mantra was for. They don't even know that it's a mantra, because I've heard this sort of cliche all the time. It's like, we used to say sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. But now we know that's not true. Names do hurt you. And it's like, oh, for God's sakes, if names never hurt anybody, you wouldn't have to come up with a catchy little rhyme. You teach children in order to help them deal with the fact. The mantra wouldn't even make sense if names didn't actually hurt. But you have to create it in a society where you're expected to be able to live with people you dislike, to live with people, and go through the unfortunate sort of normal childhood experience of sometimes being having kids be picked to you and being excluded. But sticks and stones don't break my bones, but names will never harm me. In terms of like the good it did for kids, excluded kids, and I was a pretty weird kid myself, and for a lot of my childhood, and I was definitely beaten up many a time. But the empowerment that actually the idea of like repeating this to yourself, it's like, nope, your names can't harm me. Meanwhile, it seems like what we were telling students is not only can names harm you, there are even subtler ones that you may not have noticed that might be unintentional, but nonetheless are tiny forms of violence against you. And even worse, you should say ouch. So the idea of saying ouch, like, it just makes it so much worse, because it's kind of like, yes, make this automatic. Make it something where your mind can't really distinguish it between it and physical pain. It's just such terrible advice. And that's kind of like one of the things, also to really summarize kind of mine and Height's work together. A lot of it is kind of like, stop giving students horrible dysfunctional advice and then being shocked that this isn't working out very well. Mm-hmm.
So in 2000, what did the book, last year, 2000, yeah. What was last year, 18?
No, nobody knows anymore.
I know. As you get older and older, the years just,
yeah. I got to tell you, 2019 still sounds like the distant future in my head.
I know, it's bizarre. It's bizarre.
We should have teleporters by now.
But since the book came out, well, when the first article came out, This was a problem that people were thinking was just on campus. And you had just mentioned that we're starting to see it percolate in corporations and media, which of course are corporations as well. The book was the number one book recommended by Bloomberg business leaders after it first came out, which I think says something about what business leaders, one, are reading, but why they're reading that, where their minds are at. Because anecdotally, we've heard that businesses are having a hard time adapting to the generational shift, some good, some challenging.
Yeah.
related to iGen or Gen Z.
Yeah.
So what have you heard from business leaders? What are you thinking? I mean, I know your stock tip is to invest in HR companies.
Unfortunately, it tends to always be followed by, and I can't go on the record for this, you know, and I hate to even give that kind of information sometimes because it's kind of like, I can't tell you who my sources are. But time and time again, you know, I have people talking about how their employees have, you know, in the most dramatic cases, have turned the everyday work, in some cases of helping other people, you know, people who work for nonprofits, into sort of a daily drama about interpersonal relationships within the office.
That often now involve HR departments because they don't want to mediate them themselves.
Which just sounds incredibly dysfunctional. Now, I hope that this isn't wide. It's like just like one of these things where there's that little glimmer of wanting to be proven right, you know, as someone who's studied something for a really long time. But then ultimately, as a human being, not wanting to be right, you know, and in this case, I hope it's subtle, or I hope it's not as big of a deal as I'm afraid it is. But on the other part of my thinking is that if this is, if the phenomena is bad as we've seen on campus, even if it's a fraction of this, this is going to mean that some companies are going to go down due to sort of unparalleled internal strife because employees can't figure out ways to sort of mediate their own interpersonal relationships without it being destructive.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, has there been any studies on?
It's so recent there almost couldn't be, because like the first members of Generation Z, only born really 1995, 1996 or later, or have only recently started graduating.
So we're only getting anecdotal stuff. I mean,
yeah,
I'm reluctant to tell our listeners, you know, have you noticed a generational shift in the workplace? You know, email us, so to speak, at thefire.org. I mean, please don't reveal anything about your HR departments, right?
Yeah.
But like, have you noticed a generational shift, in which way? Good and bad.
And by all means, if you haven't, tell us that too. Because that's interesting. Because mostly people are coming to me. I'd actually I've had some talks where I've spoken to HR people pretty exclusively, and and it's definitely it is a concern. It's like what is the working environment going to be like when Gen Z hits the working environment? Now, what it might mean, given that we've seen a lot of these problems more clustered in elite colleges, it might mean hire more from the great state schools that we have, where we haven't seen this problem be anywhere as intense. That would actually be kind of a nice outcome if we actually moved a little bit back from our weird hyper worship of the Stanfords and Harvards and Princetons and all that kind of stuff, and you know, started not necessarily preferring people from those schools quite as much. That would actually probably be a good outcome.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear what our listeners think. Again, the email is so to speak at thefire.org. I want to move now to another change that we've noticed, or at least something that's been investigated more since the book came out, is how these phenomena are manifesting themselves or not internationally. You were just in Italy to talk about the book. Any sense of whether some of the same phenomena exist there? I know John was just in Australia and New Zealand and started to see some of these issues percolate there, but they have different dynamics there. For example, a lot of the schools are commuter schools, so you're not seeing the same thing happen on campus that you would in the United States, where not everyone, a lot of people live on campus, especially at the elite schools.
Yeah, definitely. And John has some really interesting data on this and some stories about it on the Coddling website. We called it The Coddling, partially.
Thecoddling.com.
You should watch the video, because we chose that title partially trying to sort of make light of the title, which we've picked on many times. So as best we can tell, this is happening in the Anglosphere, in the English-speaking world, to a greater or lesser degree. We've definitely seen some really intense versions of it on elite campuses in the United Kingdom. Now, the next question are these trends, and partially because some of the things we use to describe why we think this is happening include phenomena that hit children across the world at roughly the same time, like having access to social media in their pocket since they're very small, for example, is one of the 6 causal threads that we talk about in the book. Political polarization, is another one that we talk about that's surely gotten worse in the Anglosphere. Now, the next question is this happening in other countries that had similar technological shifts but have very different cultures? And so going to Italy, I was invited to Italy to speak at a conference invited by an Italian professor who teaches actually in Nebraska, I believe, and her friend from Spain, who they had an entirely different take on the book. Like they were most fascinated by the fact that we were talking about sort of bubbles, safe spaces, so to speak. And they did this incredible exhibit, all about the concept of solitude in American
they say it's
society.
mostly an American phenomenon.
Yeah, they were saying that solitude is essentially a word that was given to the English language by Americans, more or less. And I don't know if that's entirely true, but it was very interesting to hear from an Italian perspective about how intriguing the idea of solitude not being loneliness being this idea of like it being a negative experience of being alone, whereas solitude is about being alone being a very positive experience and something that I think of solitude as great, good. And to see such a different spin on the work that we've done at Fire, but also the work in the book, was fascinating to me. And I definitely want to just pick her brain endlessly about it. Do I know if some of the other trends we're talking about in coddling are going on in Italy? I don't know. I think I needed to speak the language better.
Yeah, it's funny. I watched the video of the panel, and they had a real-time translator for the audience, which looked huge.
It was that was definitely a really humbling experience, and I was just so humbled to find out that we had anything to do with inspiring the amazing professors who were involved in it, and the intellectual quality of the discussion at that conference was great. If you speak Italian, we should provide a link.
Yeah, if you go to the coddling.com, you can see some of I think John's notes about some of his travels and some of the things he's observed in other countries. He notes that as far as he can tell, the Germanic and Scandinavian countries have not yet fallen, and I'm quoting here, for paranoid parenting and overprotection like the English-speaking countries. They still send their kids to forest schools and let kids play outside with friends unsupervised by age 6. Lower levels of inequality and status anxiety have been credited with taking off some of the pressure that American parents place on children.
Yep, there's a really great book about that with a unfortunately very boring title that talks about income inequality and its relationship between status anxiety and paranoid parenting. I wish I could remember the name of it, but it's something like Love and Parenting, and it needed a catchier name.
Did you listen to it in audiobook form?
Yeah, make sure that we have a link to it, though. I'll give you the full information for it afterwards.
Yeah, so it's on inequality in parenting.
I think it's called Love and Parenting and something. Yeah,
I'm writing that
it's just
down.
not very memorable. So sorry.
It's okay.
Now talk about a memorable title, though. A book about the focus on independence and cultivating a sense of independence among kids in Germany, which is an interesting.
The Achtung Baby.
It's called Achtung Baby, which is like that's a title.
So, what are the plans to kind of continue to examine this book and its themes moving forward? We have seen more research on some of these themes. We have seen, when you first wrote the Atlantic article, you were speculating that you might be seeing a rise in anxiety, depression.
And we were hearing reports from campuses that this was the case, but that
overwhelmed, medical offices.
But that wasn't showing up in the data yet, and that wasn't good enough for John. To me, hearing from people on the ground that this was happening was pretty persuasive, but still, it's not the same thing as data.
And then you still had data. You had more data by the time this book came out. But since then, the data, and especially some of these trends internationally, has become overwhelming insofar as it's kind of corroborated what we've long expected, correct?
Say that again, sorry.
So the data is kind of corroborated. You're finding more and more data that levels of anxiety and depression are going up.
Yeah, particularly for young people, and that there does seem to be some correlation between that and social media use. General use of the internet, not so much, which wasn't really a surprise. We weren't as concerned about screen time. And people playing video games, we weren't really expecting any negative effects when it comes to a lot of the phenomena we're talking about. But we do think that the sort of interpersonal aggression that social media makes so easy for like grade schoolers could surely be a negative influence.
Yeah, and what was it? I'll try and copy it in the show notes here. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education recently about, like I said, overwhelmed counseling centers.
Yeah.
I don't know, is work on campus getting harder than it was, and there's the burden's higher, or is it something to do with the psychology that the book discusses?
Well, it's interesting because it's like I felt the same way kind of like after we finished the 2015 article, which was sort of like, well, that was interesting. What's next? And part of like what's next in my mind is, given that it's sold over 200,000 copies, I think at this point, like its goal was to reach a lot more people than we would normally reach, and it really overachieved on that. But now I want to see if we can harness the contacts we've made through this and the interest we've gotten in this for good. And the good that, of course, is most important to me as the president of FIRE is to see if we can turn this into something that can help reform the situation for free speech on campus. And one of the things that I've been really hitting hard when I'm faced, and I face particularly from conservatives, I hear this kind of like, oh, there's nothing to be done, campuses don't believe in free speech anymore. It always sounds like really sort of over the top to me. And the reason why it's frustrating is because I know that basic things haven't been done yet. And that's one of the reasons why I came up with a list of sort of 5 easy reforms that universities can make, that you should be nagging your university president to make. And, chief among them are things like tell them to obey the law, tell them to recommit to freedom of speech, tell them to stand up for their professors and students, not just when they get in trouble, but right away and loudly. That makes a huge difference. And then simple things like teach about freedom of speech and academic freedom at the beginning of orientation, which it's shocking that most universities don't do that, but they don't. And then finally, collect data on the state of the health of freedom of speech and free inquiry on campus. And I'm trying to focus sort of laser-like on that because I think that there's a lot of concern that something's gone wrong in higher education. And I think to a degree something has. And that also includes things that aren't really FIRE issues, but nonetheless I think a lot about like cost, for example. I think a lot about. But for the issues that we care about, we haven't even really scratched the surface yet of basic reforms that need to take place. And I know that there's lots of interest in fixing things, some pessimistic, some optimistic, but not really a battle plan for where to start. And I think this is where you should start, with these 5 basic, common sense, reasonable reforms.
Yeah. What more have we learned about political polarization on and off campus since the book came out? There was this Hidden Tribes study.
Oh, yeah.
That might be worth touching on. It just seems like I think anyone who reads the news, watches the news, knows that we're at maybe an inflection point, or maybe we've passed it. I don't know.
The Hidden Tribes study is amazing, and I really recommend it to everybody. You definitely have a link to it as well.
Yeah.
It's super interesting, and actually when I first read it, my first tweet about it was, this so well comports with my own experience and point of view that I'm suspicious of it, because it's too on the nose. And there was a stat in it that got a little bit poo-pooed by some of my, good friends on Twitter, saying, that 80% of African Americans, 80% of almost everybody thinks the term political correctness is a negative term. But something like only about 30% of this sort of like top 8% of that they call the progressive activists think it's a negative term. And I've seen a lot of people go like, well, they don't define political correctness in that. And I've heard this argument so much, I'm like, it completely misses the point. That most of the population, overwhelming majority of the population, hear PC and they're like, that's something bad. There's a tiny group that's like, well, that's not so bad. That actually sounds like that could be a good thing. And it doesn't matter what you're filling in the blanks as meaning. You're hearing a term that everybody else hears as bad as actually being potentially good. And one of the things that the Hidden Tribe study found that was so interesting was that there was this, they broke society up into about 6 different groups, and there was, and tried to figure out where they were together on different issues. And at one extreme, they had what they call progressive activists, people who, are really into issues of like what might be called sort of the cutting edge of social justice work. And they found, which comports with my experience, that it was a very upper class group. It was the most upper class group. It was most highly educated. But, not a surprise to me, having seen some of these trends start in San Francisco, the least racially diverse group of any group other than the most extreme right-wing group that was almost exclusively white. And seeing it kind of as a problem that is more of sort of like a peculiar ruling class problem helps you at least have some hope that it can be solved. So definitely checking out the Hidden Tribes study, I think it is very worthwhile. It gave me some hope that there's a solution here. But
so this cohort, the progressive activists, this is the same cohort that you're mainly focused on in the book, that sees the overprotection, the lack of free play, the schedule time. Is this also the group that on campus is the source of a lot of calls for disinvitation, microaggression, policing, trigger warnings, calls for censorship?
Definitely the demographics are the same. And one of the reasons why it's important for even skeptics to look at this is because there's always been a big disconnect between what upper class, ruling class people think the poor and downtrodden need and want and what they actually do. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of times in like 19th century sort of reformist movements, there was a sense of, well, we don't care what they actually want. We care about what they should want. And, whether it's people thinking that they need more opera or they need bloody revolution, when you actually sometimes go to actually ask the actual worker what they'd want, it's like, I'd like Sunday off, like something much more, maybe some more leisure time.
I'd like the bus to arrive on time.
Yeah. So something much more practical and much more humble in a lot of cases. And so I think understanding that since a lot of the sort of moral authority of what you see for some of the social justice activists on campus is that, I speak for the multitudes. You should not be so sure you really speak for the multitudes, particularly given how out of touch in a lot of cases, frankly, some of these institutions actually can be with the rest of the world.
Cancel culture. Is there anything that you've learned from the book or that the book says that can speak to? I mean, I've only started hearing the phrase cancel culture in the past couple of months. This like idea that certain people need to be canceled for, in some cases, admittedly, major transgressions. In other cases, taking the wrong side of a political debate.
Yeah. Cancel culture, that's definitely a term that's relatively new to me, but not a phenomenon that's even slightly new.
I mean, you've been dealing with professors who've been trying to be canceled since the beginning of your career.
Yeah, it's kind of, and what's funny is to say something, a prediction on which I was perfectly incorrect. Will Creeley, the legal director of FIRE, and I wrote a big cover story for the now defunct Boston Phoenix back in 2006, talking about this relatively new phenomenon of Facebook.
What is that?
Of people getting in trouble for what they posted on Facebook. And it was very early. So a lot of the first cases we saw of people getting in trouble for Facebook were people posting pictures of themselves smoking pot, and you had to be like, stop posting pictures of yourself doing illegal things, on Facebook. Then they were sort of like nasty little infighting incidents followed. There was one in the drama school of University of Tennessee, which I always thought was funny because it's drama. But then they just became part of the ecosystem. But there was a little sparkling moment when there was a like Miss Teen USA lost her crown because she was. There would find to be like erotic photos of her somewhere, and then there was another like Miss USA or something like that who lost her crown for another reason. This all happened in the course of a couple of weeks, and then by the third one, it was like lewd bar pictures of one of these beauty queen people, and society's reaction seemed to be like, okay, we've kind of had enough of this. Mm-hmm. And I had a glimmering moment of being like, okay, listen, if we're going to actually live in the society where we live so publicly, our culture is going to have to change to a degree where we become, and this is where it gets incredibly wrong, more forgiving of people's failings. If we know, for example, that people tend to be big drunks when they go to college, when we start seeing videos of that, we should recognize that we always knew this. So let's understand that we have to be tolerant of this stuff. And so I thought that actually increased awareness of what people are actually like would increase tolerance. And I think it felt like for a while it did, but then something happened, and it seemed to happen very quickly. And people who are on Twitter talk about this. First, Twitter seemed to be a place where everybody was free to be weird, to be who they were. And then suddenly, like the cancel culture, as we now call it, like the really strong polarization, the really sort of group formations got really nasty. And that's how you get books like So You've Been Publicly Shamed by Ron Johnson or John Ronson.
John Ronson.
Which I always get wrong. Fabulous book. And that's, when we made our movie, Can We Take a Joke? It was about this burgeoning kind of like nasty, I'm going to ruin your life for what you...
So ahead of its time, really. I mean, all you have to do is look at the most recent Chappelle stuff. I mean, that's what he's talking about now, a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I really hope it will.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you think's worth touching on before we close up here with the review here of the 1-year anniversary of Coddling?
It's one of these things where I really would love to hear from people who read it. Feel free to write.
So to speak at thefire.org. I'll forward it along to Greg.
We're trying to do more to reach out to high school students to teach them about free speech.
That's actually a good point.
Yeah.
Constitution Day is coming up.
Oh, yeah,
What
yeah.
a great opportunity to utilize, if you're an educator, Fire's new First Amendment curriculum.
Yep.
Which you can find on our website under the resources tab.
Our First Amendment curriculum, also our videos. We have a graphic novel now. I'm working on one of my own, at some point. Write us, because we know that there are people out there who want to do something about the situation for young people and for on college campuses, but also in, say, K through 12. And we want to use the opportunity while people are paying attention to this to try to make some real change.
Yeah. So email us at sotospeak@thefire.org. I promise you I see all emails. Until next time, Greg, I appreciate you coming back on the show talking about the book, and I urge all of our listeners out there, if you haven't picked up the book yet, you can now get it cheaper. It's in paperback. You can find it at Barnes & Noble and Amazon. So, Greg, thanks so much for coming on the show, and thanks for writing this book.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, this podcast is hosted and produced by me, Nico Perino, and recorded and edited by my colleague, Aaron Reese. If you like the podcast, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. We can also find more information about the show on Facebook at facebook.com/so-to-speak-podcast, and also on Twitter at Free Speech Talk. Again, our email address is sotospeak@thefire.org. We love to hear feedback, and until next time, thanks again for listening.